Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Helena, aka No Justice MTG. I'll be joined later tonight by Dalia Gebrial. Coming up tonight, net migration has fallen to a 4-year low, while asylum hotel numbers are up. We'll discuss the generational divide in UK politics, what I think the Greens and left-wing parties could potentially do about it. And finally, Foreign Minister Yvette has called on the international community to do more for Sudan. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. And make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat. Chancellor Rachel Reeves' budget has gone down well with the people who matter most to her. The markets seem pretty pleased by the budget, or at least relieved, with the pound strengthening and interest rates on government bonds dropping slightly immediately afterwards, though that rate has now gone up again today. And MPs were pleased too, especially those on the left, after Rachel Reeves dropped the Tories' 2-child benefit cap, though not before she'd spent a year immiserating Britain's poorest families. Not included in this happy portrait, however, are ordinary voters. What did they make of the budget? ITV spoke to some of them.
The contribution that the lower paid is disproportionately higher than those who have higher income, and that is not fair.
I've got a good job, my partner has a good job, and we're still not well off in the slightest. We're still having to cut back where we can. So I can't even imagine what people are doing who are struggling.
Those were reactions to the Chancellor's £26 billion tax raid, with much of that coming from workers following a freeze on income tax thresholds until 2031. That means that as salaries rise, more people will be drawn into 20% tax who weren't paying it before as they pass the basic rate threshold. And more will be drawn into the higher 40% rate. In fact, 1 in 4 workers will be pulled into that band. Meanwhile, the highest paid in this country won't feel any change at the top, as their rate of tax for earnings over £125,000 remained unchanged. Now, in the manifesto last year, Labour pledged not to raise taxes on working people, and in one sense they've kept their word. No tax rate is increasing. But that doesn't mean working people aren't going to feel the pinch over the coming years. On Good Morning Britain, Reeves was asked to justify that decision.
Increasing taxes puts the squeeze on working people. In your manifesto, you said Labour will not increase its taxes on working people. Then, last year in your budget, you acknowledged that extending the freeze on thresholds on tax would hurt working people, which is why you said last year you would not do it. How can anyone believe anything you say?
I'm Chancellor in the world as it is, not in the world that I might like it to be. And I do have to respond to new forecasts and events unfolding around the world. So from 2028, I have made that decision to freeze those thresholds. But next year, whilst the cost of living is still an acute challenge for people, I'm taking £150 off people's bills, as well as those freezes in prescription and rail fares that I mentioned to Ed. I'm not pretending that what I did yesterday is not asking working people to contribute more, but because of other changes we've made around gambling taxes, around higher value properties, means that I was able to keep that to an absolute minimum.
But you acknowledge that when you make a promise in the manifesto on which millions of people vote, when you make a promise in the House of Commons publicly, you acknowledge we can't believe those promises because they could be broken.
Well, Susanna, in the manifesto, it is very clear that it was rates of income tax, national insurance and VAT.
I apologise for interrupting, Chancellor, but that's not true. In the manifesto, it's clear. You said, quote, Labour will not increase taxes on working people. Labour will not increase taxes on working people.
And then the next sentence.
It couldn't.
Yes.
Yeah, but then, you didn't have to put that sentence in, Chancellor. You put that sentence in.
Susanna, the next sentence, straight after that. But Susanna, if you then carry on reading the next sentence says the rates. But I do recognise that we have asked from 2028 people to contribute more by freezing those thresholds for an additional 3 years.
Now, I don't know why they put her on TV. I understand she's in a powerful position and people want to hold her specifically to account, and that makes sense. But don't get Rachel Reeves on the morning round. We had the situation. It's not good look. She's not a good media performer, regardless of what you think of her policies. when you come to her policies there, I think that whilst she's correct in saying that the next line of the manifesto said they wouldn't raise the rates, the rhetoric before the election was not raising taxes on working people. The rhetoric preceding that line that she's talking about, that was pointed out by Susanna Reid, was rhetoric about not raising taxes on working people, right? And this is clearly a fudge to get around the fact that they have this kind of get-out clause in the second line by talking about rates rather than the overall level of taxation, right? Like, it is an increase in tax that will be paid by working people. And you can argue that that's necessary. You can argue that in a social democratic economy, you want to expect everyone to contribute, that you can't just have a taxation system in which only other people pay for it, right? I think we should have a wealth tax. I think we should be increasing capital gains. I think capital taxes should be higher, as that's money that you make from owning stuff rather than money that you earn by working and being productive. But we can't just expect other people to pay taxes forever. But you can only do that if you have the public's consent. You can only form a kind of new social contract, right? A new understanding of who should or shouldn't pay tax if you have a democratic mandate to do so. And if you're going to try and do that in terms of policy by having get-out clauses in your manifesto, whilst in the run-up to the election say we won't raise taxes on working people, it very much undermines, if not the letter of what the manifesto said, but it certainly undermines the spirit of what the manifesto said. Because there were other choices that she could have made. She could have done a wealth tax. She could have increased capital gains tax in line with income tax, for example. But she didn't do that. Instead, she raised taxes on working people when she said that she wouldn't, even if it was only in terms of the freezing of the tax bands, the fiscal drag, rather than the actual rate. And it's worth pointing out as well, she admonished the Tories when they started this kind of fiscal drag situation, because they were the first people to do the fiscal drag, was the Conservative government. And she admonished them, essentially implying it was a stealth tax, because it is, but it's okay for her to do the same thing, essentially because everyone realises in terms of government that taxes do have to go up. They have been low for too long. We have a much lower overall tax take as a percentage of GDP than social democratic economies in Europe, lower than the Nordic countries, lower than France, significantly lower than France. And if you want good public services, we should have the income from taxation to ensure that we can afford to do that. But you can only justify that if you have the democratic mandate, which I don't believe Rachel Reeves has. Now, because of the cut to the 2-child benefit cap alongside that tax rate, the papers have billed this as a tax and spend budget, and some of them have been pretty gruesome about it. The Daily Mail ran with spiteful raid on strivers to lavish billions on Benefit Street. The Express also resurrected that trope, calling it a budget for Benefit Street. And The Sun did the same, also stating that families would foot handouts bill for skivers, and even had the Benefit Street logo on the front there, as you can see. What they don't say is that most of the money to be raised through fiscal drag is actually about headroom and not about welfare. For people who don't know, fiscal headroom is the amount above the stated expenditure in the future that is being brought in and they expect to spend, right? It's that level of extra breathing room in terms of meeting those fiscal rules. Now, the cost of cutting the 2-child cap on universal credit is just £3 billion a year. The benefits, however, are immeasurable. With the cap in place, Britain was on track to have more than a third of its children in poverty by 2030. Scrapping the cap lifts 500,000 children out of that scenario by 2030. And in the immediate future, drops the percentage by nearly 5 points. But the benefits of dropping the cap may extend further for Labour than just feeling good about themselves. These dots represent different constituencies around the country, with the size of these dots indicating how many children on average are in households affected by that policy. The higher the dot, the higher the child poverty rate in that area, while the further right the dot, the greater the percentage of the household affected by the cap. As you can see, Labour controls most of the areas that will be most impacted by dropping that cap. A cynic might suggest that the change of heart is more about performance at next year's local elections than a soft spot for kids. But what I will say is that in the run-up to the budget, Rachel Reeves did an interview with Andrew Marr. She gave pretty good arguments for scrapping the 2-child cap on universal credit. For example, the poorer kids are more likely to be in poverty as adults. They're more likely to therefore need access to the welfare state, going to be a bigger burden on the NHS, be sicker because of the poverty they've grown up in. So you're saving money down the line by ensuring fewer people are in poverty now. But remains to be seen whether or not that they're doing it for cynical or for moral reasons. Although you'd expect if they actually cared about the child poverty, they would have done it last year, rather than removing the whip from all those MPs who voted to get rid of it with a SNP amendment. Interesting. Dalia, what's your take? First of all, I want to know what you think about this return to the benefit street rhetoric of the 2010s, something I thought we were past, and also about the two-child cap on universal credit.
I mean, we aren't past the benefits benefits Britain discourse, because our politicians and our media class keep on insisting that the divide in this country is between people who are on benefits and people who work. Now, of course, that doesn't make sense when you actually look at the data and you see that over a third of people who are on universal credit, I think the number is 37% of people who are on universal credit, are also in work. So actually, that category of people on benefits and people who work overlaps a lot more than we are led to believe. And in fact, of course, the real divide is not between people who are on benefits and people who work, but people who live off asset wealth and people who work. So the super rich and the rest of us. And, you know, when it comes to this budget, I think it's really important to think about how when we talk about the economy and improving the economy, and when politicians promise us that their priority is going to be the economy, there's a deliberate fudging of the real issues. Because when we hear that the priority is the economy, we rightfully assume that what they mean is that, you know, I will be able to afford to give myself, my dependents, my family, my loved ones a better life. But if you're not specific about what you mean, you know, you're improving the economy for whom? Are you improving the economy for everyday people? Or are you improving the economy for the already super rich whose wealth is going to be untouched by the kind of tinkering around the edges that you are doing? And this is why I think actually Zoran Mamdani's campaign in New York was really effective, because he didn't talk about the economy in a way that was abstracted from people's everyday life. He spoke specifically about affordability. You know, are you going to be able to afford a decent, dignified life, which currently an increasing number of people are unable to afford? So when Rachel Reeves and the Daily Express and the Daily Mail and, you know, the people who are loyal to the already wealthy talk about improving the economy, we might assume they're talking about things like affordability and cost of living and quality of life for the majority of people, but they don't necessarily mean that. And I think that this budget, with the exception of the removal of the two-child benefit cap, is a perfect example of why we need to get more specific when we make demands around the economy. Because this budget does not actually tackle that crucial question of affordability. What this budget does is it once again lets the super rich off the hook when it comes to contributing their fair share to society. Because when we talk about taxing the rich, we are not talking about people who are on 40 grand, 50 grand, 60 grand, even up to 100 grand. But, you know, and of course, if you are on 100 grand, you are doing comparatively a lot better than a lot of the population. You know, if you're a paramedic working night shifts on 35 grand a year, you're probably looking at someone on 100K and thinking, that must be nice. But when we talk about taxing the rich, we are talking about multi-millionaires and billionaires whose extreme wealth that they could never possibly spend in their lifetime, and even in some cases in the lifetime of their children. We are talking about that wealth, and that wealth has been left untouched by this budget. The freezing of these tax thresholds is not going to touch people who are on those very, very, very high income thresholds, or people who get the majority of their income from wealth and from assets. And when all is said and done, after this budget, we still live in a country where work is taxed disproportionately a lot more intensely than wealth. And that is not something that a party that calls itself the Labour Party should be doing. It should rename itself to the Asset Wealth Party, because that is ultimately the interests that it is protecting. And this decision to still go after work rather than wealth it's politically moronic, because you are hitting the people, the majority of the people in this country who you want to then vote for you to re-elect you. It's ethically bankrupt, it's morally bankrupt, because it's a very unfair distribution of tax burden onto people who are already struggling to live off work. And it is also economically nonsensical, because when you actually look at the figures, this implicit tax raise, obviously it's not officially a tax raise, but in practice, with incremental small wage rises, it will function as a tax increase in reality for a lot of people. These implicit tax increases are forecast to raise around £26 billion. And yet, a tax of just 2% on assets over £10 million would raise roughly the same amount of money. And when you look at the impact of that, not only would a tax on assets above £10 million impact a tiny, tiny sliver of the population, something like 0.04% versus the 1 in 4 people that are likely to be hit by the de facto tax increases that Rachel Reeves has put in this budget. You are talking about a tiny sliver of people for whom, if you have assets of over £10 million, what's a 2% tax to you? That's not going to impact, that's not going to have a significant material impact on your ability to do basic things, on your ability to, pay for care for your elderly dependents, on your ability to make sure that you can afford, good quality food, on your ability to make sure that you can afford good quality housing. And yet these tax increases, de facto tax increases, are going to affect a much larger proportion of the country and affect them a lot more intensely than the alternative, which is a high value asset tax. And so my question is, if you need £26 billion, say, to plug the black hole in the NHS, why would you go for a route that impacts a much more significant part of the population and impacts them in a way that they will feel much more acutely, than to go for that tiny number of people who own an astronomical amount of wealth, and to hit them in a way that it won't actually materially hurt in any serious way? I actually don't know the answer to that, other than political cowardice and loyalty to the already super powerful. Those are the only two things that I can think of as to why you would pick that, a much more undemocratic, burdensome, unjust route. Now, of course, when we come back to this question of benefits Britain and all of this, my criticism of this budget is not the same as the criticism of the right-wing press, the Express, the Daily Mail, again, who want to pit working people against people who are on benefits, when in reality there is overlap between those two categories. And also, it is not people who are on benefits who are robbing working people blind. It is actually people who are on benefits and people who are working who are being robbed blind, taken advantage of by the super rich. Not to mention that the indefensible opposition to scrapping the 2-child benefit cap, as you showed in your graph, Helena, the scrapping if we had kept the 2-child benefit cap, we would have been forecast to have over a third of children in poverty by 2030. And any society that has a third of children in poverty is a doomed society, because you are robbing those children of a decent future. And that is something that all of us who live in our society, other than the super rich people who seem to live in this kind of parallel universe in their gated communities, who can basically choose to isolate themselves and build a fortress between themselves and the rest of us. For those of us who are on those tax brackets that are going to be impacted the most heavily by this budget, we are going to have to live in the same society we're going to have to live in a society where a third of children are in poverty, and that is horrific for all of us. And so I do agree that this budget unfairly goes after working people, but that's not because I believe that people who are on benefits are taking money out of the pockets of working people. It's in fact that astronomical wealth that is being made in this country that has been left untouched by this budget for no other reason than I can assume political cowardice and loyalty to the already powerful and the already super rich.
Sticking on the subject of whether or not Labour have kept their pre-election promises, who remembers this from June 2024 when Shadow Home Secretary was speaking to Laura Kuenssberg?
Last year, the most recent figures say net migration was 685,000 people. So when you say you want to bring it down, what do you mean? Do you mean by 1, by 1,000, by 100,000, by 200,000?
No, we clearly want to see significant changes in place because we have seen the numbers treble. We have supported the government's changes that they've made. Those have yet to play through, and those will lead to further restrictions on
already
visas.
Have been some falls, in fact. But I just want to press you on this point, because a few months ago, somebody in one of your colleagues, the Shadow Chief Secretary, Darren Jones, told us a normal level would be around 200,000. So is that what you mean? Is that the kind of number?
Well, again, and I understand the question, and I know that you're effectively trying to suggest I set a target or a broad target. I'm not going to do that. We are going to be clear. Net migration must come down. We believe it's really important, and what Care has set out is commitments that we will bring net migration down.
Well, turns out that this is one commitment that they have managed to stick by, and that by some weird twist of fate, apparently Darren Jones can tell the future. Today, the Office for National Statistics released the migration figures for the year to June, and it shows that net migration has fallen to just 204,000. The previous 12 months, the last of the Conservative government, showed net migration figures of 649,000, meaning the latest figures represent an almost 70% drop in net migration, a big win for Keir Starmer. But how do the figures break down? Net migration essentially is calculated as the number of people migrating to the UK minus the number of people leaving. So this number could represent either a fall in arrivals or an increase in leavers. The reality is that it's a bit of both, but it's mostly driven by a big drop in arrivals. The number of new arrivals has dropped by 400,000, a significant decrease, and the number of people leaving has also gone up by a modest 43,000, albeit still at record high levels of immigration. The ONS attributes most of the drop in non-EU migration to the Tories' immigration reforms from early 2024, which heavily restricted the ability of work and study visa recipients from bringing dependents with them. Unfortunately for the Tories, they will be unlikely to get this to cut through with the general public, as one of the main reasons migration has become such a salient issue is the reaction to the so-called Boris wave, where net migration almost hit 1 million people a couple of years ago, and the effect of the Tories' belated migration reforms has taken effect too late for them to claim the credit. If we bring up the statistics for non-EU migration reasons, you can see the Boris wave peaking in 2023, with the vast majority of the new arrivals coming here for study or work, part of Johnson's vision for a quote-unquote global Britain, along with a big spike in humanitarian visas in 2022 because of the situations in Ukraine, Afghanistan and Hong Kong. You can also see that although study visas have only fallen slightly and are recovering from a low at the start of the year, work visas are continuing to fall. There is an economic cost to this, however. A reduction in student visas will reduce capital inflows to the UK, making our balance of payments worse. And it will take desperately needed funding away from already struggling universities. And a reduction in people coming here to work will hurt recruitment in areas such as health and social care, which relies heavily on migrant labour. One of Labour's biggest missions in the run-up to the election was to have the highest sustained growth in the G7, but one of the biggest drags on growth is a stagnant productive base. Here's Times economics editor Mehreen Khan explaining succinctly how this reduction in migration will hurt the economy.
And the reality is this country hasn't really grown in productivity terms for the last 2 decades. The economy grows because the population grows. Tax revenues grow because more people pay those taxes, and often those are newcomers to this country. As a country, we are still able to attract people who want to live and work here. That's not true of lots of aging, developing world economies, and I think we're kind of looking a gift horse in the mouth when we want to say not just no illegal migration, but this will inevitably just spill into a debate about migration, and it will have fantastic economic implications for this country where migration has basically been the main main driver of growth in this country since the financial crisis.
To break down what she's saying, take a look at this chart. It shows contributions to the economic output over the last 40 years. You can see that since 2010, the vast majority of increase in our productive capacity has come from increased labour output, as Tory austerity crippled capital investment and what's known as multi-factor productivity, which can be approximated roughly as innovation, i.e. anything that will make existing workers more productive in the same amount of time. Now, if it weren't for people coming to this country to live and work since 2010, we would probably have been in permanent recession. And unless Rachel Reeves can pull a magic productivity rabbit out of the proverbial hat between now and the next election, her growth promises seem completely out of step with her party's immigration promises. Contrast this to Spain, who have embraced immigration, and they have the highest growth in the EU. It's also worth pointing out that regular migration is only one half of this debate, and whilst Labour have seen the public's desire for reduced migration satiated, they still have to contend with the politically thorny issue of irregular migration. The new migration statistics don't make rosy viewing for the government on this issue, unfortunately. The number of asylum seekers awaiting their case in hotel accommodation has gone up again in the last 3 months, and is still higher than June last year under the previous government, despite promises from Keir Starmer to end hotel use by 2029. It remains to be seen whether they'll be able to meet that promise given Shabana Mahmood's draconian asylum reforms, but today's figures threaten to overshadow the government's successes in meeting their promises to reduce overall net migration, regardless of what happens with the economy because of it. Dalia, what do you think will be the political fallout from the failure of the Tories to meet their commitments to reduce net migration, and the fact that the Labour Party have seen it go down significantly under their watch, regardless of whether the fact it was the Tories' policies that caused it?
I mean, look, I think, first of all, I just think it's really sad that we have come to a situation where migration is just seen as like an inherently bad thing, and that driving down migration is an unquestionable good. I mean, it's that is a sad state of affairs, I think. I don't understand why the idea that people might want to come to this country is seen as an inherent negative. But the kind of the headlines from these announcements is, and what I would say as well is that it's unlikely that this kind of low level of migration is going to be sustainable, and I will explain why. But I think that what Yvette Cooper, Keir Starmer want is they just want those headlines, and that is what they are constructing policy around, is to be able to get those sound bites, those headlines, and whatever that mean, whether that means a substantive change is not necessarily relevant. But the headlines from this announcement are two things. Firstly, that net migration has fallen to pre-Brexit levels, and also that the profile of migration has changed away from the kind of regular visa route, skilled worker visas, towards asylum applications. Now, I'm not surprised by that, because when you reduce the regular pathways of migration, you will see an increase in irregular pathways. And asylum is, of course, not an inherently irregular pathway to migration. It is a fully legally enshrined right to seek asylum. But because the government has also closed down safe and legal routes to asylum, it means that many people seeking asylum have to arrive by irregular means. And that is, for example, the small boat crossings. And the question that I have is, who exactly benefits from that change in profile of migration? It doesn't benefit people who are migrating to this country, because no one moves to this country in order to stay in limbo in a hotel for several years, where you can't work, you can't put down roots, you're being vilified left, right, and center. Your life has to essentially go on pause. And of course, the housing of asylum seekers in hotels in this limbo is also not good for a society where what we want is for people to be able to come to this country and live and be part of our communities, and to live good, dignified, fulfilled lives. That is beneficial for us as a whole, for us as a country. But also what you have to remember about when you see these kinds of headlines is that the British economy is structurally dependent on people who are not born in this country. And that has always been the case. It has been the case since the British Empire, when this country, the Industrial Revolution, growth in this country was reliant upon the labor of those in the colonies. And then when colonialism formally ended, we still rely on the labor of those people, but also we are relying on people who migrate here, who fill the labor shortages in our country. Because especially with an aging population, we simply do not have enough people of working age to sustain our economy. It's a simple fact. And so bringing down net migration does not change the structural dependency of this country on foreign-born labor. What it does is it changes the terms and the conditions on which that foreign labor is able to operate. Now, we see, for example, the scrapping of healthcare visas, health and social care visas. That has dropped by 57% in the past year. It will likely be replaced by something else. I just spent 9 nights in a hospital, and I can tell you that place does not survive without foreign-born labor. And I think, and all while I was in hospital, I just had this pit in my stomach, this disgust that was just like, I cannot believe that political opportunists have managed to convince this country that these people who are working night shifts, not just as nurses, care workers, but cleaning, porters, making this hospital function, looking after us when we're sick, that we have been convinced that these people are the problem. But anyway, I digress. The health and social care visa is likely to be replaced by something else, because you can't overnight take a system that has, from its inception, relied on migrant labor and then suddenly expect it to work when you've cut that inflow by more than half. So it will likely be replaced with something that allows for the recruitment of foreign-born labor, but basically dispossesses them of any kind of settlement rights. So those people are going to have to come. They're going to have to wait a lot longer, up to 10 years or more actually, for settlement. 20 years, I think, is the number. They're not going to have any access. They're not going to be able to bring their family. So they're going to be expected to care for us and our family without being able to care for their own families. They are going to be here present as labor, but without any rights. And I don't think that's anything to be proud of. I really don't think it's anything to be proud of to have these people who we have always relied upon, who do the most essential work of this country. When COVID-19 happened and this category of essential worker had to be invented because we had to really pass out, who are the people that this country cannot run without? And a disproportionate number of those people were foreign-born people. And so we are still going to have to rely on them, but we're going to make their lives hell. I don't think that's something to be proud of. I think it's a very sad, embarrassing situation, shameful situation. And as I've said before, it's a shift in the social contract that we have away from the post-war system towards something that is more like Dubai or Singapore, where you have this underclass of migrant labor who have no civil rights, no political rights, and who are heavily exploited. And like I said, I don't think that that's something to be proud of. I don't think that makes for a functioning, humane society. I don't think that's something that we should be aspiring to.
And that's so important, is that actually when you poll people in this country and you ask them specifically, people coming here to work in the healthcare service or to work in social care, right? The ability of people to come here because they want to contribute and they want to do something that a lot of British workers won't do, that we have a struggle recruiting for, and there are loads of vacancies. People overwhelmingly support it. If you talk about the necessity of the things that immigrants do, people's opinions change. But then when you ask them about the broader figure, that the number go down or up, they will always say they want it to go down. But again, they've not really been explained to them the contribution of migrants to this country, or indeed the fact that a large number, especially of the Boris wave, were people as students. They were coming here to buy our expensive degrees, to study at some of the best universities in the world. One of our key parts of our kind of country's history and prestige is that We have these age-old institutions of learning that people can come from all around the world to study at and to pay good money for it too. We turn it away just because number is too big. We turn away people working in the healthcare service because the number is too big. It's a real myopic way of looking at what is, as you say, a very important part of our economy and has always been historically, from the Windrush generation till today, especially in the post-war period. People remember it's always been a part of the kind of the fabric of society, relying on people who come here to contribute. Absolutely, I absolutely agree. And also interesting that you brought up the fact of an aging society. Pretty relevant for our next story tonight. The welfare bill is ballooning. This is something that we keep hearing in the wake of the November budget that finally ditched the 2-child cap on universal credit. But it's not universal credit that's causing the welfare bill to balloon. It's not even the rise in PIP claimants that the press insists is unsustainable that's causing the ballooning of the welfare bill. It's not immigrants claiming housing benefit or the motability mafia, as the right-wing claim. In fact, if you added all these things together, they would still not be seeing the same rise in spending, or indeed the same overall percentage of the ballooning welfare bill, as the reality of what is actually increasing the most. The reality is that the biggest outlay in the welfare budget is the state pension, and given the current government's commitment to the triple lock, it will also be the part of the welfare budget set to rise the most by 2030. The welfare budget is expected to reach $406 billion by 2030 in projections, and almost $200 billion of that is pensioner spending. That's a projected rise of $44 billion, compared to a rise of just $41 billion for universal credit, disability benefits, and child benefit all put together. This is the legacy of the triple lock on the state pension, which guarantees that the state pension will either rise by inflation, the rise in average earnings, or 2.5%, whichever is highest. It was introduced in the first budget of the coalition government by then-Chancellor George Osborne of the Conservative Party, the same budget that froze public sector pay, froze child benefit, and capped housing benefit. That budget perfectly encapsulates the state of the economy for the last 30 years, especially since the financial crisis. Cuts for working-age people, but increased money being given to the retired. In budget yesterday, Rachel Reeves froze tax thresholds for working people again, reduced ISAs but only for people who are under the age of 65, and taxed private pension contributions for working-age people as salary sacrifice schemes, but did not touch the triple lock. Whilst working-age people were struggling with the cost of living crisis as inflation outpaced wages, the state pension was pegged to inflation, so rose at the same time, meaning that for the retired, it wasn't really as much of a cost of living crisis when they see their incomes rise at the same time as prices. Not that much of a crisis. Now, it's not just the welfare spend that's lopsided in this country. One huge inequity in our society is housing. House prices have risen stratospherically in the last 30 years, meaning that those who bought their house in the 90s have seen their relatively modest investment become a giant asset out of nowhere. This means that in terms of how much people earn on average, it's much harder to buy a house now than it was in the 1990s, with house prices now over 7 times average earnings as opposed to just 3 times average earnings in the 90s. That's before you even talk about the fact that these are the generations more likely to have access to right to buy, meaning that not only did they have access to a low purchase price, but it means young people of today can't get a council house. And if you can't get a council house and you can't afford to buy, it means being thrust into the private rental sector. And you'll never guess who you're going to be paying rent to. The average age of a landlord in the UK is 58, and 35% of UK landlords are retired. So that's yet another transfer of wealth from the young to the old, and from the asset poor to the asset rich. Yet another failure in the reductions of council housing, the easy access to buy-to-let mortgages in the 2000s, failure to build new requisite housing because of NIMBYism and poor planning, and the treating of houses as an investment vehicle rather than as a home to live in. What a thought. Another thing we commodified was education. Tuition fees were introduced by New Labour and then trebled by the coalition government. Student loan repayments had already led to a marginal tax rate of over 70% for some working-age people. And in the last budget, the repayment thresholds were frozen on student loans from April until 2027 until April 20... Sorry, start that one again. And in the budget, the repayment for thresholds on student loans was frozen from April 2027 until 2030, meaning some people on just over the minimum wage will now start making student loan repayments in that period. Yet older generations who went to university for free who got final salary pensions and a triple locked state pension were having a meltdown over a means testing of a £300 winter fuel payment, something I disagree with, but nevertheless. There is a yawning gap between the generations that is stark when you look at polling. The Green Party and Labour are first and second respectively with the entire under 50 cohort, yet for the over 50s it's Reform and the Tories, and the gaps between the left and right in each cohort are pretty big too. Ironically, for the pensioners to vote for anti-immigration and anti-welfare policies, when the pension bill relies on migrant labour and the next generation of workers to fund it, yet they're happy to accelerate an ageing population with low birth rates and low immigration, meaning future generations will have to pay even more as the working age population decreases. What we're seeing really is a total breakdown of the social contract, right? Older Tory voting generations are no longer planting trees so that future generations can sit in their shade. I would ask if it's become a generational war, but in truth, it already is one. It's just only being fought in one direction. There's a very strong argument that parties of the left, who are unlikely to win over older generations anyway, should lean heavily into the side of working people and young people to redress the balance in what has become something of a gerontocracy. But I don't think, personally, that zero-sum divisive politics is something that we should be encouraging, even if I think it probably would be pretty politically effective. So how do we fix this? First of all, young people have to start voting, and voting in the numbers that older generations do. The older generations have been pandered to by government after government after government because they turn out to elections. They're reliable voters. And if the young refuse to participate, at least not at the same level, they'll not be targeted by policymakers. Secondly, we need to rebalance our economy. We need to end the triple lock by pegging pensions to wages so that pensioners and workers have the same policy incentives, i.e. both pensioners and workers want wages to increase rather than just asset prices. We should abolish landlordism to stop the transfer of wealth from the young and asset poor to the older and the asset rich, and build a new generation of council houses to give working people cheap and stable living arrangements to have families today that will sustain the pensioners of tomorrow. Dalia, how do we fix these problems?
I mean, it's a difficult question because, as you say, it feels as though our political class is trying to entrench that divide rather than bridge it because they benefit from it. They make the calculation that older people are more likely to turn out to elections, and therefore they want to attach a particular political identity to that generation in order to sell it to them. But it is true, as you say, that the generational war is already here. I mean, election after election, we are seeing that more than any other factor in many ways, other than maybe education level, your age is the most reliable determiner of who you will vote for. Now, it's of course not true across the board. I actually tend to find that, it's not true across the board. There are lots of people who have become, including, members of my own family who, as they've gotten older, have actually gotten more left-wing. But the data suggests that the overall trend is older people are much more likely to vote very differently than younger people. Now, it has long been the case that younger people tend to vote more left than older people. So that in itself is not new. But I think that there are a couple of things, there are actually three things, I think, that mean that the moment that we're in now means that divide is A, wider and more difficult to bridge, and B, is likely to have a different trajectory than that divide has historically had. I think the three causes, I think they are about the extent, they're economic, they're political, and they're geographic. I think the first thing is the extent of economic polarization between the young and the old is more stark than ever before. Millennials were the first generation to be worse off than their parents by almost every economic marker since the 1800s. So that is new in recent history, that younger people are more likely to be poor at every stage of their life than the generation before them. So that's an economic polarization that has an intensity that we've not seen in the past 200 years. The second is geography. So because of the financialization of our economy, we are seeing young people being sucked into cities. And so that means that when you have a constituency-based electoral system like the one that we have, young people's voices are going to be disproportionately underrepresented because they're basically only being represented in a few major cities, whereas older people who maybe built their wealth, bought their assets before the full force of the financialization of the economy took place, their voices are more evenly distributed across the country. So the geography of our political system means that they are going to have an overrepresented voice. And that's, of course, on top of the fact that older people are more likely to vote anyway, because young people don't feel like any of the parties have anything to offer them. And I think the third thing is the nature of the political concerns. You know, one of the biggest priorities amongst young people, not just in this country, but across Europe, is climate. And that is something that young people are disproportionately and more uniquely vulnerable to than older people. You know, it's at least in this country, of course, around the world, the impacts of climate breakdown are being very acutely felt. But in Britain, at least, climate breakdown is much more on the radar of young people because they are looking at their future and they are aware that climate breakdown is going to have a knock-on effect on so many parts of their lives. And so those three things basically mean that not only is this generational divide more acute and intense than it has been historically, but also I think what's interesting is that the things that because, normally people tend to get more conservative as they get older. What's interesting is that the material shifts that normally result in people shifting to the right as they get older are not likely to pan out. First of all, those assets are unlikely to be passed down to the younger generation. I think for a lot of those older people who own assets such as their home, there is a very high chance that those homes are going to have to be remortgaged, sold to a property developer in order to pay for their care costs, which are astronomical. So we're not going to see that transfer of wealth when the older generation pass away. And also because of the forecast that millennials and the generations below them are not going to meet the economic milestones that generations before us have reached. Secondly, the question of geography. There's no reason to believe that our economy is going to become less urbanized over the coming decades. And thirdly, climate is not going anywhere. Now, does that mean that necessarily the way that young people in the future are going to politically respond to the climate crisis is going to stay the same? No, there are very scary right-wing responses to climate breakdown. But the three main things that I think explain the intensity of this generational divide are not going to shift in the same way that they have historically, that have resulted in young people getting more conservative as they get older. Now, the caveat that I would add to that is that whilst, yes, young people are more likely to vote Green or vote for, I don't know if I can call the Labour Party a centre-left party at the moment anymore, but the young people are yes, more likely to hold leftist opinions. I would say that there is still also a political polarization happening amongst young people, where we are seeing, yes, young people being pulled towards radical left-wing critiques, but we are also seeing young people, and it's a smaller number of young people, but they are there nonetheless, who are getting pulled into way further right than the older generation are. And that is a response to that breakdown of the social contract. It's a result of young people seeing that the status quo is not serving them. They're looking at their future and they're seeing that they're going to be worse off than their parents. And they are saying, the system as it is not working for me. And they are going to fall on either side of that polarized spectrum. And so at the moment, it looks kind of more favorable because it looks like generally people are shifting towards that kind of more redistributive, progressive political identity. But that's not necessarily going to hold. And that's where I become very concerned, actually, about how the refusal to tackle the fact that that status quo is not working is going to not necessarily have the political output that you and I, Helena, would want. And I think, it's really easy as a young person, which I think I can still count as, I'm 30, knocking on the door of 33, but I'm definitely in the generation that have been screwed by this. It's really easy to feel this very acute resentment of older people because of this sense of older people not being aware that the reason that they are better off than us is not because they were smarter or harder workers, but because they grew up in an economy that had these incredible guardrails that meant that they were able to actually make something of their lives. They had a decent welfare state. They had a housing market that was under control. They had strong unions. They had good welfare. They had jobs that paid, that you could work a normal job and live a decent life. And they don't attach their success to those structural guardrails that have been removed from us. And so it can be very easy to feel that resentment of, why are you voting to take away from us the things that you had and the things that are why you were able to build a decent life? But there's no reason why, political coalitions cannot be rebridged between older people and younger people, because after all, the younger people who are facing, staring down the barrel of a climate crisis, of a broken economy, of all of these problems, they are the children and grandchildren of those older people. And I'm sure those older people, if you sat down and asked them, do you care? Are you concerned that, your children and your grandchildren are not going to be able to live decent, dignified lives? They would agree with that. They would say, yes, I do care. And so it's about really showing that the vision for the world that young people are currently fighting for is in fact the same vision of the world that older people also want. It's just that our political class has benefited from a divide and rule approach, which is kind of screwing all of us over, because I don't think that older people are looking at the futures that are being laid out for young people and are happy about that. So really, I think, yes, the Green Party should really lean into mobilizing and activating groups of people who are politically disillusioned, many of whom are young, but there is no reason why that cannot be done in a way that shows that our concerns are actually much closer to one another. When you scratch the surface, they are much closer to one another than they are divided.
Very, very powerful words there. I absolutely agree with you. And I want to make it very clear. I thought I made it clear in my piece earlier on, but I'll just make it extra clear. I think that going down the divisive route of trying to do the generational warfare the other way, I think that's a bad idea. I don't think it's good for society for the left to start doing that, to appeal even more to younger voters. But you could do that and it probably would be successful. But I think it would be a bad idea. And a lot of responses I usually get when I talk about these things is, oh, well, I'm old and I vote left-wing, or my friends vote left-wing. These people are in a bubble, unfortunately. When you look at the statistics, when you look at every general election for definitely the last 15 years or so, overwhelmingly, people vote Conservative if they're older. That trend significantly increases, right? And what's interesting, as you mentioned before, that's always been the case. It's not to the same degree, though. If you look at if you plot the graph of how people voted by class in the 1970s versus now, it used to be people voted overwhelmingly by class, regardless of their age. And actually nowadays, that class voting is kind of broken down, and now the age cohort is the defining factor in whether somebody votes for the left or for the right. And that is just what the statistics say. And I do think it would be easier for society and better for society to try and find a way of bridging that gap so that we can rebuild a social contract so that those trees can get planted from one generation to the other. But again, it's also, even if they do vote that way, I want to make it clear as well that there is a problem of political economy, right? One part of Thatcherism was this idea that you change people's opinions by changing the economic base, which is quite a Marxist take, really, for Thatcher. And what that did is by making an economics of individualism, created a society of individualism, right? And it does engender this idea that what I did was my success rather than the success of the macroeconomy or the situation that I was in. Because it was a very unique situation where you sell off the welfare state. The people who were there are the ones who benefit. The people who were there to buy the British gas shares because they told Sid, right? Like, those people stood to benefit then. But everyone else after that generation, they don't benefit from those same things, right? Only one generation can benefit from this huge raise in house prices. And it was none of their fault that they were there when it happened. But there needs to be some acknowledgement. I think that's what I'm really looking for, is an acknowledgement that that situation, as you say, was a structural one that they benefited from, that will need to reverse somewhat so that the structure is fairer from one generation to the other. Otherwise, as you say, I fear that that resentment will grow. And I don't want it to be that resentment, so I think it'd be bad to campaign on it. But unless we fix those things, I think it will be there. I think we will see even more of that if we don't do something like get rid of the triple lock so that the state pension still rises, but it doesn't outpace wages, so the working people are getting less while pensioners are getting more. And they should rise at the same time at the same rate, in my opinion. The situation in Sudan is worsening, with the UN describing it as one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of the 21st century. More than 150,000 people have been killed as paramilitary group the Rapid Support Forces battles government forces. Both sides have been accused of atrocities, while the RSF is accused of genocide, and 14 million people have been displaced. It's true that the crisis isn't being given enough attention. It's also true that the foreign states who are fueling the fighting with money and arms, the United Arab Emirates in particular, are lucrative UK allies. So who might be in a position to put pressure on them to stop? Who, I wonder? Who, you ask? Take a look.
I think we need the same international energy coming together around Sudan as we've seen come together around Gaza to get a ceasefire there. We have to get a ceasefire in Sudan urgently, given the mass atrocities, and shine that spotlight. And I'm continuing to speak to the Quad countries, that's the UAE, that's also Egypt, that's also Saudi and the US, about keeping that urgent pressure on to get the ceasefire in place. And I have deliberately made the issues around Sudan one of the top priorities here in the Foreign Office, because this is the worst humanitarian crisis of the 21st century. So we need that whole spectrum of pressure on other countries that have ability to influence what is happening in Sudan, also on issues around the weapons, the external support, and also this urgent humanitarian aid. We have to shine this spotlight and not look away.
Not going to mention them though, are you? Very interesting, the coded language. The countries who are responsible, who are engaging in it. Which country is that? Which country is that, Yvette? Do you want to name them? Might that hurt some potential trade deal with Chris Bryant off in Dubai, trying to do some trade deal? Very interesting as well, if I have to say. We need the attention that Gaza had, and she's not wrong to say that it deserves similar attention to Gaza, given the scale of the humanitarian crisis and what looks to me like a genocide being committed against Sudanese people by the RSF. But you can't be Yvette Cooper. You cannot be a member of the Labour government and talk about like the scale at which that there needs to be international attention on Sudan is similar to Gaza. I mean, like, well, you were part of the axis that was defending Israel during its genocide in Gaza. Your government increased arms sales to Israel more than it had been previously, despite the kind of virtue signal of the very small number of arms licenses that were rescinded. You had people going on trips to Israel to meet with Gideon Sa'ar. You were out there having a meeting with Gideon Sa'ar about Maccabi Tel Aviv fans, while you should have been criticising the fact that they were committing genocide. So to try and say that, there needs to be international attention to Sudan because it's a terrible situation similar to what Gaza is, I'm like, well, maybe you should look inward first, right? At the relationships that you have, first of all, with Israel, and of course, the United Arab Emirates. But again, you can't even call out Israel, but you'll pretend, or you'll kind of gesture a calling out the UAE with regards to what's happening in Sudan. Dalia, she's really talking out of both sides of her mouth there, isn't she?
I mean, it's obscene. And I'm seeing this increasing tendency from people who are essentially apologists for the Israeli genocide of Palestinian people, who are trying to delegitimize the steep and righteous opposition, popular opposition to Zionism and solidarity with the Palestinians. These apologists for Israel use Sudan as a kind of rhetorical device as a kind of whataboutism. And none of this is out of genuine investment in the righteous cause of Sudan, but rather to try and deflect criticism of their own role, including our own government's role in the genocide of Palestinians. And it is absolutely foul. It is disgusting. It is disgusting to reduce the horror of the genocide against the Sudanese, to reduce that to a rhetorical battering ram. It's a disgusting trivialization of Sudanese life. And look, it is undeniable that Sudan has not gained the international popular attention that Palestine has had. And within anti-colonial movements, who, by the way, unlike Yvette Cooper, have the moral and political authority to interrogate this unevenness in attention, there have been important discussions and mobilizations and thinking about why this unevenness in attention has happened. And, I have my own theories as to why this might be. I think it's primarily because, especially in the West, we've lost a tradition of international solidarity where we treat these struggles as being zero sum, as being separate, and as somewhat kind of competing for attention. This idea that if you give one struggle airtime, you're taking airtime away from another struggle. I don't think that's true. In fact, what is happening in Sudan and what is happening in Palestine are not the same, but they are deeply interconnected. And one of the ways in which they are interconnected is in the role that Britain is playing in it, the meaningful role that Britain is playing in it. Much like in Palestine, Britain is historically and contemporarily complicit in the current atrocities we are seeing. Firstly, in the historic divide and rule that was part of the British Empire that laid the groundwork for conflict and genocide and instability that we see in Sudan and across the formerly colonized world, but also more urgently in the complicity of our military industry, something that is part of Yvette Cooper's jurisdiction as Home Secretary. So, we have, much like Britain is sending F-35 components to Israel to be used against the Palestinians, we are also seeing that we are continuing to sell arms to the UAE, which, according to the UN, have been found to end up in the arms of the RSF, who are committing a genocide against the Sudanese. And so in both contexts, it's that primacy of the military-industrial complex above all else. It's the devaluing of life, particularly of the lives of people in the global south. And it's our broken imperialistic geopolitical system that are the root causes of why we are seeing a genocide in Palestine and in Sudan. But for people like, and for those of us who are protesting for Palestine, we actually have the moral and political authority to apply that analysis. And we have a political responsibility as well to make those connections and to mobilize for Sudan. But Yvette Cooper, as someone who is complicit and who has refused to stop the selling of British arms to genocidal regimes, whether it's the RSF in Sudan or whether it's Israel, as long as you are continuing to sell arms to a genocidal regime, you have no political and moral authority to say to protesters, well, you should be, because that's the implied audience of what she's saying, of the things that she is saying. You have no moral or political authority to call anti-colonial protesters, anti-imperial protesters out when you have not only the ability but the responsibility to actually do something to break the supply chain of the genocide. And it is a choice that you are on a daily basis refusing to make. You don't get to bring up the genocide. You don't get to instrumentalize the genocide of the Sudanese people as a gotcha against people who are expressing solidarity with Palestine. You've not shown me in that you genuinely care about the genocide taking place against the Sudanese people. In fact, what you've shown me is that you devalue their life so much that you are willing to reduce them and their suffering to a rhetorical device, which is cheap and tacky, to say the least.
Couldn't say fairer than that. Thank you very much, Dalia, for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me, Helena.
Always a pleasure to enjoy Ladies' Night with you on a Thursday. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow with more Novara Live at 6 p.m. But for now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.